I'm Lou Wagner, one of the senior fellows at the AUSA, and I just wanted to thank you for joining us for this contemporary military forum, the Army Modernization, a Life Cycle Approach to Lethality. Now, although I commanded AMC, I was a combat arms officer, so I really like that word lethality that I see out there. As your professional association, you know that the end warfare are proud to have these forums, and we not only have them here, we have them throughout the year in our headquarters here in Washington. We call them hot topics. They're one day long. They cover things like aviation, air defense, fires. It goes on and on with the people with expertise. We apparently do that to educate not only the people that aren't aware of it, but also to educate industry about what's going on, because I will be honest, sometimes we don't get the proper word out to industry, and we need to work hard on that because you play such an important part. We can't do this alone, however, without the support of people like you. If we have a strong membership which attends these meetings and then passes on what we try to do to the rest of the public, it would be great. We have 121 chapters now throughout the United States. What I'd like to ask you now is, would all of you hold up your hands who are not members of the AUSA? I always look up here because I caught one up here 2 years ago that wasn't. Well, if there's only 2 or 3 of you that aren't members, I can shut up right now because if you aren't, you can get a special deal now. However, I would strongly recommend that you take the lifetime membership. I've never claimed to be the brightest guy in the world, so since I've been a member of the AUSA since I was a lieutenant, I've probably spent over $1,000 in membership, and I could have gotten a lifetime at that time for about $250. But it's donated to AUSA, so that's okay. For you few people that, very few it looks like, that are not members, I suggest that you go downstairs right after this and sign up in booth number 307. They'll be happy to sign you up, and you can go for the lifetime, 5 years, 2 years, whatever you want to do. But the more members we can get, the better job we can do. With that, I'd like to turn the floor over now to your moderator here, Mr. Russell, and he will take it from here. You got it.
Thank you very much. All right, so what we're going to do today is we're not going to have opening statements from our panel members. We'll actually just ask questions, and we have some early questions that have already been submitted in that we'll actually ask each of the panel members. But before I do that, what I first want to do is I'll give a very short bio for each one of our panel members so I can introduce them to you. So our first panel member is Ms. Stephanie Easter. She currently serves as the Acting Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. In this role, she leads the execution of the Army's acquisition function and the acquisition management system. Her responsibilities include providing oversight for the total life cycle management, sustainment Army weapon systems, and equipment from research and development through test and evaluation, acquisition, logistics, fielding, and disposition. Previously, Ms. Easter served as the Principal Deputy to the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. Our next panel member is Lieutenant General John Murray. He's the Deputy Chief of Staff, G8. Lieutenant General Murray was commissioned as an infantry officer in the United States Army upon graduation from the Ohio State University in 1982. Throughout his career, Lieutenant General Murray has served in leadership positions and commanded from company through division with various staff assignments at the highest levels of the Army. Our next panel member is Ms. Leisha Adams. She's the Executive Deputy to the Commanding General at AMC. She assumed the duties as the Executive Deputy Commanding General, EDCG, effective August 9, 2015. Ms. Adams is responsible for material lifecycle management, acquisition support, personnel and resource management, industrial-based operations, enterprise integration, research development, and science and technology for a globally reaching command with over 63,000 personnel with an impact or presence in 144 locations globally and in all 50 states. And previously to this assignment, she serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Material Readiness. Our next panel member is Brigadier General Joel Tyler. He's the Commanding General, Joint Modernization Command. Brigadier General Tyler was commissioned in armor from the University of Arkansas, Army ROTC.
Armor.
I don't think it's been a good football year so far, sir, but
It's a rebuilding decade.
rebuilding decade, okay. He's currently assigned as the Commanding General of the United States Army Joint Modernization Command at Fort Bliss, Texas. Our last panel member is Mitch Schneider. Mitch is the President and CEO of Bell Helicopter, Textron. He was named Bell Helicopter's President and Chief Executive Officer in October of 2015. And Mitch joined Bell Helicopter in 2004 and has held several leadership positions within the company. And I did those as short. If you want to see their full bios, I'm sure you can look them up online. But I didn't want to take too much time reading bios today. All right, so what I'll do is I'll start with a couple of set questions, and then hopefully as we go through, we'll get more and more questions in from the audience, and we can begin to answer your questions. So let's start off with the first one, Lieutenant General Murray. If it's okay with you, we'll start with you. So what does the Chief of Staff of the Army intend to achieve by reducing his modernization priorities from 10 to 6?
So I would not really characterize it as a reduction from 10 to 6. And so a little bit of background first. Last year, we did a process called the SPAR, the Strategic Portfolio Analysis Review, which if you've been reading anything, you've heard that term. And what that was focused on was a very narrow focus on a high-end fight in Eastern Europe. And so we came up based upon TRADOC's capability needs assessment, plus a lot of modeling of that simulation, and identified the 10 most critical short-term gaps the Army had to fight that type of fight. After being in a counterinsurgency fight for the last 16 years now, if we had to go back to fighting the way that I was trained to fight when I came in, what were our 10 most critical short-term capability gaps? And that's what the 10 identified that's been referred to as the Chief's modernization priorities, which is really a mischaracterization of what those were. The 6 we're talking about now that I believe the Secretary and the Chief talked about today, and you've seen them in various publications: long-range precision fires, next-generation combat vehicle, future vertical lift, the network, air and missile defense, and soldier lethality across move, shoot, and communicate, are truly cross-cutting, not necessarily short-term capability gaps, but where we, the Chief and the Secretary, intend to focus their undivided attention for many, many years, not fill short-term gaps, but we see this as not only what we need now, but what we need building into the future.
Okay. So maybe a follow-on to that, ma'am, Ms. Easter, is the 6 modernization priorities. We've heard about these cross-functional teams aligned to the 6 modernization priorities. How will the cross-functional teams align, and what will ASALT's role be in their function?
Okay, thank you. I'll start by just giving a little bit overview of what we envision cross-functional teams to be. It is a team of people led by an operator who is going to take responsibility for ownership of the requirements process. The concept is to include your program managers, your acquisition logisticians, a budgeting person, a science and technology person, all on an integrated team to inform the requirements process from the very beginning, with the desired outcome of having a better defined requirement up front so that we can speed up the entire process and have an integrated approach going forward. I believe that'll be a great construct for us to follow within the Army. The role of the program manager will not change from what it is today. They will still be responsible for the things they're responsible for today: life cycle support of equipment and for equipping the Army. The big difference is they will be involved up front, integrated with the cross-functional team director and others, to be involved from the very beginning, from what I call concept, all the way through fielding. So it's it's fundamentally different than the way we're doing business, but it has some of the main characteristics of it. I would say that the biggest difference will be that integrated approach, and making sure that requirements are informed up front with science and technology and with affordability and the state of technology, so that we don't make some of the mistakes we've made in the past, where we've gone forth on a major program just to find out later that the technology was not as mature as we thought it was. It also allows us to be more iterative in our approach to acquisition. So again, the program manager's role is well defined. They will do exactly what they do today as far as once the requirements are defined and the chief of staff decides that he wants a material solution, then the program manager will take the lead in that area in support of the cross-functional team director. I think it'll be a great opportunity for us to work more closely and more collaboratively together, and as a result, I think we will be successful in getting capability to our warfighters in a much shorter time frame.
Thank you very much. So maybe we'll skip down one to Brigadier General Tyler. How does the Joint Warfighting Assessment fit into the Army's full life cycle approach to modernization?
But I'm glad you asked. No, this is really an exciting event because the first real Joint Warfighting Assessment will happen next spring. So last October at Fort Bliss, we conducted the Army Warfighting Assessment, and I think we have an opportunity here in the spring of 18 to really integrate those joint elements and continue integrating the multinational elements that we started with the AWA. The AWA really has three purposes, and one is to enhance training and readiness, and the second is to really enable joint multinational interoperability, and then the third is to inform the future force. So you see from those three key tasks that the chief has given us, really you see sort of a construct of tonight, tomorrow, and the future. And that fits with an article that General Perkins wrote, I think in July, that came out. And so we see that as we look at the fight of today, through the rubric of today into a scenario that allows us then to implement some of the near-term aspects of the theater, we see the ability to possibly pull out from that lessons for the future force. And in this JWA, we'll be looking at some of the big C concepts, what we call that, big C concepts, how we, again, inform MDB, and also what we would think of traditionally, or that we saw in AWA, some concepts and capabilities you'd find at the tactical level.
So, Ms. Adams, how do you see sustainment process policies changing as part of its modernization? How is sustainment part of the modernization process?
Thank you, Tom. Well, the Army is pursuing a balanced approach to equipment modernization for today and the future. And so when we look at modernization, there's S&T for the new next-gen capability. There's the new development to ensure improved mobility, survivability, and lethality. And there's modification to existing systems to buy back weight, space, and power. And then there's recapitalization, which addresses obsolescence and ensures sustainable readiness. So really, sustainment has a role in all of those areas. The S&T community needs to address the failure modes as they are developing the technology, because when you think about readiness and operational availability, that, you know, kind of a quick formula is uptime divided by uptime plus downtime. And if you don't understand that failure mode, that downtime, then you won't be able to achieve the reliability that a system needs once it's fielded. So early on, the sustainment community needs to be involved, and as Ms. Easter addressed with the cross-functional teams, AMC Sustainment is a representative in that team. And then also in the development process with the sustainment key performance parameters, the reliability, maintainability, and ONS cost key system attributes. That's where the sustainment community can influence the development of the system. We help the acquisition community address the portability trades and identify the ONS cost drivers. So as we go through the development process, we're addressing sustainment from the beginning. Then our depots apply the modifications and perform the recapitalization in support of the PM. For example, we have recapped 382 UH-60s in the last 10 years, where 13 modifications are applied in conjunction with maintenance. The UH-60 average fleet age is 20 years, and we expect the UH-60 to be in the field until 2050, and a recapitalization enables it to have extend its service life another 20 years. Also, the Patriot system, it goes through a recap. There's 17 Patriot battalions. One is recapped a year. Letterkenny Army Depot takes that down to the bare metal and replaces obsolete parts with new design. They've been able to reduce the number of line replaceable units that a soldier has to do in the field. So that not only reduces maintenance task, it reduces repair cycle time, and it improves readiness. So in working with ASALT, we have addressed changes in policy in terms of transition to sustainment, to identify those criteria that are required as the system prepares to go into sustainment, make sure AMC has the skills, the infrastructure, and the tools to execute sustainment. We also, ASALT has an operational sustainment review that looks at how the system is performing in the field against the performance requirements, how the product support strategy is performing, and looking at ways to adjust that if necessary.
Thank you. So maybe we can pull in some industry perspective in this conversation. So we haven't really talked about changes in the acquisition process, but I'm going to add that as part of the question.
Okay.
So as Army leadership initiates changes to the acquisition process and adjusts its modernization strategy, how does that challenge industry?
Okay, well, I appreciate that, and I can tell you that as an industry partner, we very much welcome the changes that are being proposed going forward. These changes, I think, allow us not only to be involved in the requirements process up front, but allows us to really partner with you to bring the capabilities to the warfighter much sooner than you can right now. Some specific examples that I can give you is one is the research and development that we have. It is independent research and development, but we're not really saying, that we want you to tell us how to do it, but if you coordinate with us on what your gaps are and capabilities, that allows us to use our funds and funnel our money towards those capability gaps and look at technology that will help solve those problems. And that could be technology in terms of capability that can be brought to the warfighter immediately or in the sustainment areas as well. So there's multiple ways we can use our technology to bring that to bear. And when we do those technology evaluations, we're looking at how can we move towards, some people say fail fast, but as we work with our research and development and then work into technology demonstrations, what we're trying to do is understand, is this technology ready or not? To really bring that to bear quicker in the process. I usually tell my team, my innovation team, you're not really failing, you're really succeeding, and show us ways not to do it. Or is there other technologies that we can approach? So I believe by coordinating our research and development, by looking at technology demonstrations to really prove out the subsystems or the systems, and then moving into prototyping. I really believe rapid prototyping of capabilities. If you look at our history and legacy with industry supporting the warfighter, we used to rapidly build things quickly to understand, is this going to support your need? Does this meet the operational requirements? It also helps us formulate, can we really manufacture and produce the technology that meets those needs? And does it meet the cost targets that you were after? So I think, the IRAD, the tech demos, the prototyping really brings that to bear. And finally, what I would say is I think what you guys are doing with JMRTD and Future Vertical Lift really is bringing that home. I mean, you think at the beginning of that, you collaborated with industry on the requirements, what we thought generally the requirements could be. We then moved in to work together and contractually, and it was a joint investment. It was investment by the government, but it was also heavily invested by industry. We worked together throughout the design process, collaboratively working within our design space together in every design review and showing you what we were doing as we went through that process, and culminating now with flying aircraft that are full-scale flying aircraft. So at the end of this, you will have the ability now to go, evaluate these aircraft and look, did the capability bring to the warfighter what they need? And how do we tweak the requirements going forward for future vertical lift? Did it meet the cost targets? Can we manufacture the product? I think it really brought down risk moving forward with future vertical lift.
So before I ask the next question, I just wanted everybody to know it's sort of like church. There's lots of empty seats up front here. For those of you who are standing in the back, if you'd like a chair, there's plenty of room. Please feel free to move to the front. Let's do a follow-up to that from an industry perspective. And how do we need to adopt requirements and acquisition processes to stay relevant from your perspective?
Okay, I would think, and it's kind of what I just mentioned, I think the thing is really for you to embrace industry through the process early on. I think having the teams work together to understand not only what the capability and requirements are, but what is the art of the possible from industry. And I think you can quickly converge on the requirements and the capabilities. And there's a lot of good feedback where you may have a requirement that you don't realize you may have just doubled the cost. And that may have been a requirement that was on an outer edge of an envelope, et cetera, that you may say, well, if we don't take that, what do we end up in a cost target? Or is the technology mature enough? So I think collaborating together, we could help you quickly move those requirements. Just to give you an example on the commercial side of the business, what I've done there is we actually quickly concept up an aircraft and we use 3D modeling, the new design tools that we have. We put the system in virtual reality. So we actually have the warfighter climb into the aircraft. They can sit inside the aircraft, make changes in the aircraft virtually, walk around the outside of the aircraft. So that quick upfront requirements analysis converges rapidly on the commercial side of the business. Within 90 days, we can have a good requirement no matter what the segment of the industry we're trying to reach. So I think we can bring those tools to bear, and I'm not just talking about myself. Industry has all these tools, and we can really help you up front with that. And I think you can get through your AOA and your CDDs much quicker than you currently are if we partner together.
And I'll just add to that, I think a key aspect of this is our ability to accept incremental capability. Right? So as we go through this, as we rapidly go towards getting something in the hands of our soldiers right away, we have to be willing to take, I'll call it the risk, for lack of a better term, for having the 80% solution initially. But what we need industry to do to help us in that, though, is to make sure that the systems that we are designing and developing are modular in nature and have an open systems architecture so that when it comes time to give the additional 20 to 10%, we're able to do that without basically starting over or doubling the cost of the capability. So I appreciate your comments, and I think it's going to take efforts from both sides, for us to leverage what you're doing and for us to kind of, I'll say, reset our expectations that the first thing we get is going to answer every desirement that we have. I think that's going to be a balance that we're going to have to work towards together.
Anyone else want to try that question? Or? No? Okay. Okay, so ma'am, I think this one's for you. Congress has given the services more control over acquisition programs in recent years. What programs has the Army taken over as the milestone decision authority, and how will that work going forward?
Okay. That is true. The last NDA, well, the language now says that any program that starts after, I think it was October of 2016, would automatically be delegated down to the service as the milestone decision authority, and we are executing that way. As far as the programs that were in place prior to that legislation being written, we're in the process right now of working with Ellen Lord, who is the new AT&L, on delegation. Prior to her coming on board, we went forward and asked for delegation of 10 programs that were currently under OSD oversight, and we were successful in getting 5 of them delegated down to us. So I'm going back with the second round of the memo, asking for the other 5, and based on conversations that we're having with Ms. Lord, I'm thinking we're going to be pretty successful with that. But with that comes a set of responsibilities, and we understand that completely. So one of the things I'm doing is challenging my team and workforce to make sure that we're ready to handle what we're asking for. I think we are, but we have to make sure that we're just as diligent as we would be if we had the oversight. The basic role of OSD on programs is changing. It's we're working towards more of an insight than an oversight. And by insight, we mean that we're going to try to leverage the talent and skill sets that they have. As you can imagine, they see things across services, and we all see things in this silo of our individual service. So I think that there's some lessons learned that we can definitely leverage. So we want to make sure that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, and make sure that we continue to leverage that cross-portfolio look from OSD. Right now, the way the rules are set up, only programs that are joint or of high interest, which is a lot of Army programs, will be considered for being retained at the OSD level. But we're definitely on the path for getting them all delegated, and I'm hopeful. But things like future vertical lift will remain, I'm imagining, an OSD program. Also, when we look at persistent cyber training environment, that is a high interest program, and right now that will probably more than likely remain under OSD oversight. Long range precision fires is one that we're in conversation about right now. Even though it is an Army unique capability, the debate we're having right now is that it has strategic implications, which it does, and we're working on that right now.
Okay, so we've got I'm trying to group different questions, so I have a bunch here on modernization, so I think we'll move back to modernization, then we'll switch back to some sustainment, because I have a bunch on those as well. So the first question is, what is the Army Modernization Command? How would it affect requirements, the speed of the acquisition process, and cross-functional teams?
Okay. So I'm not sure there is an Army Modernization Command, because I don't think that the Army has, and those of you that heard the Secretary-in-Chief at their press conference, is the Army has decided to do something different because, and this is my opinion only, that we have tried over a number of years to put Band-Aids on a wound and not done a very good job fixing that wound. So I think the Army has fundamentally decided to try something different, do something different. What exactly that is yet, we still have to work through. And I think you've probably heard that Lieutenant General Ed Cardone has been tasked over the next few months to look at organizational structure, what functions are in, which functions are out, the most effective way of going after doing something fundamentally different that will fix a lot of the issues that you mentioned, Tom. CFTs will be a fundamental piece of this. CFTs, Ms. Easter didn't mention, there's 6 of them right now, potentially 8 that will be stood up. They will report directly to the Undersecretary of the Army and the Vice Chief of Staff. So that is the leader focus on those 6, and the 6 I talked about were against those priority areas that I mentioned. So that's the leader focus on those areas. Whatever the organization is called, it still is very much to be determined, but it's all about just everything you mentioned. So it's shortening the timeline of requirements, and there are some directives from the Secretary that is actually one that has been published that talks about putting standards on a system that holds ourselves accountable to certain timelines at every step of the way along requirements, which I think is a key part of that. There's one in staffing that talks about the metrics we will apply to ourselves to make sure we're measuring whether we're meeting our own standards or not when it comes time to requirements. And I think, like Ms. Easter said, the whole, at least in my mind, the whole point of the CFT is to come up with a better set of requirements from the beginning, so we're not changing requirements throughout the process. We're not asking for stuff that's not feasible from a technology standpoint. We're not asking for stuff that's going to take us years to test. And we do have industry input from the beginning. And really work with industry to start off with just a clear definition of the problem we're trying to solve, as opposed to a set of requirements that may or may not be achievable in the near term, or even achievable at all.
And just quickly, there's a short follow-up to that. I don't know if you want to take that, sir, Ms. Easter, but 6 modernization priorities, are they agile enough to adjust to the ever-changing threats?
I think so, and that's, that's also, so, whatever you call this, this organization, I think they're also going to be tasked to kind of take a better look at the future. We get accused all the time, and probably rightfully so, that we don't look out far enough to figure out what's coming next. And regardless of what we do, it's still gonna take years to deliver a new capability. If you're talking a new combat platform, for instance, next generation combat vehicle. So I think this organization will also be tasked to start taking that longer look at what is feasible, what is the requirement as we look forward. And the one thing I'll guarantee you is we won't get it right. There's just no way to look into the future much past a few years. You know, I heard this morning. If you'd gone back to 1910 and talked to the Army then about whether they'd be in major ground conflict on the continent of Europe in 7 years within the decade, nobody would have predicted that. If you'd gone back to 1845 and nobody would have predicted a civil war. So we're going to be certainly not exactly right, and the goal is never to get it exactly right. The goal is just to get it closer to right than your adversary. So I think an organization focused on what that environment looks like, that operational environment, and the Army has spent the last year and a half taking a very close look at what we think that is. And then coupled with that, the person that's responsible for thinking about the equipment our soldiers will need in that environment, I think is a very powerful combination.
And I'll just add that the 6 priorities aren't 6 programs per se. So I think that the way they've been set up, it gives us flexibility that I think we'll need to figure out what capability specifically is required within each of those 6 areas.
And to tie a couple things together, I mean, you go back to the 80s, we had the Big 5, those were programs, but there was approximately 63 other programs that came along with them. So the Big 5, and to make a point that this Easter, I mean, the original M1 tank was fielded with a 105 millimeter cannon, which we knew was not the system, the cannon we needed. But we knew to get it in the field fast, that was what we had to accept as we upgraded, in this case, to 120.
Okay, let's do a quick shift to the other end of the spectrum for life cycle management or for sustainment. And then we'll come back to this topic again, give you guys a break. To either Ms. Adams or actually Mr. Snyder, or maybe both, what or how is the government and or private sector being trained in the principles of life cycle management? And maybe we can get a government and an industry perspective on this.
Did you want to go first?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. So I can tell you that we look at it holistically that way, the total life cycle cost. You know, we look at it from the military perspective and we look at it from the commercial perspective. And so we understand that a lot of the cost of an aircraft is designed in from the very beginning. And so it's very critical for us on the design of the aircraft, the design in the reliability up front into the aircraft and the maintenance of the aircraft, because you're going to make this aircraft as reliable as possible, or with whatever the weapon system is. We're going to make it as reliable as possible, but there's going to be issues that have to be dealt with. We want to make sure that it can be maintained and not in a nice environment. It's wherever the soldiers are at, wherever they're fighting, they've got to be able to maintain those aircraft. So we have to make sure that the aircraft are there. When that happens, we have to have a supply chain that supports them so that something can happen rapidly and quickly to get that to bear. And again, we look at that total cost as from the very beginning, early design through that whole sustainment package, including the training element. I can tell you that as we look forward for the new products, the new design space that's available to us in industry with the digital thread, we call it, but the fact that we can design in 3D digital modeling and we manage our data in the same database allows us now really to take a leap forward in that technology. We actually can design an aircraft. We can make sure it works perfect because it fits together because it's all done in the same design space. The configuration management is in that same space. The same data we design in can be built, they can build the aircraft with it. We actually are building aircraft off iPads out of the same direct line into our database. That same tool can then be used for the maintainer in the field, and it can also be ported in for design, for training. So we can actually, again, the 3D space, walk up to an aircraft and actually maintain and train folks in that aircraft on how to maintain it. So we currently have our system, but in the future, we really want to employ these new tools, and I think it's going to be a step forward. You're not talking about lots of data and seed rolls. It's all in electronic space. It needs to be protected through cyber, but you design the aircraft once, you have one database for all configuration management, and it ports out to the world for everybody to use it. So I think that's one picture we're using on both the military and commercial side of looking at that total life cycle cost.
So in the government, we've always said that 70% of the ONS cost is determined by milestone A. So the design has a lot to do with what the life cycle cost is for a weapon system. And in the past, part of the way to address reducing cost was through a tech data package and being able to compete that supply support or have organic depot support in sustainment. When the Army moved to performance-based acquisition, performance-based logistics, and did away with the mill standards and allowed industry to make adjustments based upon reliability and performance in the field, then that was a way to reduce the ONS costs. Now we're somewhere in the middle in trying to define that in terms of what tech data do we need, what in order to allow our organic industrial base to operate, and how can we use our ERPs to better support the sustainment of the systems. So now that we have LMP fielded and GCSS Army fielded, the Army's looking at big data analytics to get after those readiness drivers, those cost drivers, to enable lowering the life cycle cost.
So maybe a follow-up to that, Ms. Adams, is how do you balance quick reaction need with life cycle management? Sustainment, I'm sorry, life cycle sustainment.
So typically with quick reaction programs, we rely on contractor support initially until the logistics products can be developed in order to enable organic sustainment.
Okay, thanks. Well, General Tyler, it seems like we've been leaving you out of this, so
Okay.
I have one here for you. I have a couple, actually, but we'll start with this one. The formation of an integrated acquisition team is a concept that should be very beneficial. Will this change the requirements determination or acquisition roles, missions, responsibilities, and organizations and processes?
I think, from my perspective, again, and what my organization really does is our mission statement, although it focuses on exercises, what my organization really does is to ensure that the soldier's voice is heard across the DOTMO PF, right? More than just materiel. And I've seen it in a few exercises. We tend to focus on does the robot work or not, rather than is the soldier trained? Have we provided an opportunity to allow the soldier to innovate with it? And so I would just say from my perspective, to work with an integrated assessment team, that's what I'm looking for. That's what I want to make sure is brought out from the entire process here. I think we have a lot of folks that work on requirements. I think those requirements go through a refinement, and I think that refinement is, in my opinion, is best provided by that soldier feedback and the soldiers being allowed the opportunity to innovate.
And I think that's a critical point. We talk about the CFTs, we often forget to talk about the user, which in this case, FORSCOM / the soldier. So, you know, we've talked a lot about it, and I think there's going to be a significant effort to try to get early soldier feedback into all of our programs. Before we go into even a milestone A, if we have the opportunity to prototype something or experiment with something, put it in the hands of soldiers, get their feedback, so we don't end up where we've often ended up. A few notable examples recently where we deliver a piece of equipment and you get the deer in the headlights look from the soldier because it's exactly what they weren't looking for. And so the ability, I think, to get that type of feedback through NIEs, through AWAs, through JWAs, through just giving a piece of equipment to a unit to play around with for a little while, and then give us the feedback about whether this really meets the need, not only from a material standpoint, but across, does it really fill a capability gap, or how can we make it something soldiers can use easily, but before we go into some sort of production decision.
So, Mr. Snyder, kind of following along those lines, so what Army forums do you gather capability gaps, needs, feedback from the soldier to ensure that your IRAD is right-sized?
So the way we do it right now is there's forums like this, right? This is a great forum to interface with the customer. We do have regular intervals where we get to go and talk to the customer, understand where those gaps are. So again, this is a prime example of one. The other thing that we try and do too is to get folks out to see us, also to demonstrate the capabilities that we do have, because I think that helps through the requirement process and the gaps, because sometimes as you're identifying gaps of capabilities, you may not actually have the solution, which is great, because that gives us the ability to think out of the box and come up with different solutions. So it's really kind of understanding what your desirement is or what your need is, and then let us think through, because we sometimes have technologies that was never intended for that particular application, but we actually have got a way to make that happen. So similar to what I talked about before, we have forums like this. We get together, we try and set up standard reviews with folks and interfacing and bring them to our facility. But those are the way we use to understand. Of course, we watch industry and what you guys are publishing. You've got lots of RFIs coming out too, and requests for information, and you're publishing your gaps. But the key thing is the collaboration between us, to constantly understand what your needs are and what's going on and how we can help provide solutions for you.
Great. So, ma'am, Ms. Easter, what is the Army's plan for streamlining an acquisition process that discourages protests as a regular business practice?
Those are two separate questions, so I'll try to get both of them here. Streamlining, I think I'll quote the Chief of Staff of the Army, and I agree with this wholeheartedly. If you look at the challenges we have in Army acquisition, I would say that probably 60% or more of it we control. Okay, so one of the things we're off to do is to remove what I call unnecessary constraints that we put on ourselves. For example, one just recently I've been working with my team on is like peer reviews for contract actions that are below a certain amount. There's an OSD policy that says that you don't have to do a peer review for any acquisitions, less than $50 million, but yet we are doing them for acquisitions that are maybe $1 million or $2 million. So, and we mandate it instead of leaving it up to the smart people and giving them the flexibility to determine when it's needed. So we're taking a very broad look at all of the Army regulations that we have put in place to see what we can do to streamline. Another thing, I've got a lot of my PMs out here in the audience. I'm asking them to take advantage of the flexibility they already have when it comes to documentation as they're coming forward for milestone decisions. A lot of times what's driving the timeline is all the documents and all the people that have to sign off on things before it comes up. So I'm challenging the system to say, okay, does that person need to actually sign off on that document? Or, can we go to 5 signatures instead of 15? Believe it or not, that's a little harder than I thought it was going to be because we are creatures of habit, and we have a lot of stakeholders in our business, and stakeholders take their roles very seriously, and therefore they want to sign off on everything. But those are some of I call them the low-hanging fruit that we're going after that I think we can get at right away. How to discourage protests. General Ostrowski and I have taken on an effort with the Hill to get language in that basically says that if industry lets what I'm going to call a frivolous protest, and I don't want to make light of this, there are some times when a protest is very valid and warranted, but there are a lot of times when they're not, and they can be perceived, at least from my seat, as just a way to slow things down. So we're working and having discussions with Hill staffers and others about getting some language in that basically holds contractors accountable for when they lodge a protest that is not upheld, okay, so that they can be held accountable for some of the cost and there be some penalty for doing it. Right now, I've seen just in the last 6 months, protests come in at the GAO level, they're not upheld, and then they go to the Court of Federal Claims. I mean, it's a process that's really gotten out of control, I believe. And so I believe, though, if we can get at what was brought up earlier of collaboration up front, understanding things better, we should get at that. But in the meantime, we're just looking for some language that just says, hey, right now all it takes is I was gonna say a stamp, but now it's just an email, pushing a button on a computer to lodge a protest, and we have to get out of that mode of operations because it is not helping us at all in what we're trying to do, which is to get modern capability out in the hands of our soldiers as soon as possible. So those are some efforts we got going on.
And to go back to your first half of your question, ma'am, so, I mean, so that was just post-milestone decisions. That's the little a acquisition piece of it. In the big A acquisition piece, if you go back to the requirements piece, I mean, that can easily be a third to a half of the timeline we're talking about, which is just way, way too long to figure out requirements. I think a good example of something or a way to do things different could potentially be mobile protected firepower, which we went through very clearly defined, chief of staff approved in the new AROC process requirements through the AOA in less than 6 months, and getting ready to move on to the first milestone, really with an idea that was conceived maybe 18 months ago. So that is the type of timeline. Now, that took a lot of the chief's personal energy and a lot of input from industry as they came in and talked to us about exactly what you're talking about, what's possible, what's not possible, and where are the cost drivers, and where's the real trade space for the chief when you talk about cost, schedule, and performance. And some risk involved in that, right? So the chief's number one, out of those three, his number one priority was not performance, it was schedule. So some willingness from some very senior decision makers to accept what is probably going to be good enough to fill the gap that we're after under an acceptable schedule and, of course, an acceptable cost.
And I'll just add one more to that, because you made me think about it, General Murray. And another approach we're taking, and you've seen this in a couple of acquisitions we got going on, when we're saying, okay, instead of just submitting a paper proposal, submit a bid sample, industry, okay? Bring what you have to the table on day one if you're far along in a development or a capability. And that will also help us make decisions a lot faster and get a better handle on what actually is out there and what's not. And we can make some hard decisions up front and early.
As long as we're willing to get out of our own way and say that's good enough to meet the gap that we're addressing.
That's the culture change, I think, for sure.
So we have a few more along this line. So maybe we'll start with industry and we'll come back to government.
Okay.
So how can the Army change acquisition to reverse the trend of performance compromise to meet inflated costs and schedule overruns?
Okay, so I think it's a lot of what they just talked about.
No, I think so, but I was looking for your opinion.
No, you're
so-
right, again, because really, when you get down to it, it's if you have a clear understanding of requirements up front, and we understand that you've just got to draw a line and say, this is good enough, this gets me the basic capability that we're really after, the industry can then go build to those basic requirements, fully understanding, as Ms. Easter said, if we modularize it and provide open system architecture, you can get flexibility in the future to update those capabilities, but you get to the warfighter something much quicker. And I can tell you, because I've been in this business a long time, schedule equals cost on both sides. The longer anything takes, there are marching armies on both sides, it will cost more. So anything that's drawn out on the acquisition cycle, the development cycle, the build cycle, anything that's longer is just going to cost a lot more money. So if we can converge on requirements up front, understand that this is good enough, this is most of the capability we need, but we understand that we've modularized it and provided open architecture for you to spiral later. By doing that, that allows that cost to be controlled. And I think that's part of it, is not pushing some technology beyond what's the art of the possible, and then we get into the development cycles, and then industry and the government are caught in that. Let's go with baseline capability and accept the spiral later.
And I'll just say the other part of that, another perspective on it, is just holding each other accountable. And in the case, because I think if I heard correctly, I picked up the concept of trading off requirements when you find yourself running out of money. So that's what the bid sample and stuff is about, right? So not all industry, but a lot of times we find industry working the halls and all of our organizations with PowerPoint, I call it, all right? So you're saying you're selling PowerPoint, and when it comes time to deliver, it's not quite there. So we have to be a lot more deliberate about where we are really with technology. And we cannot oversell any given capability and get into a contract and then decide later that we have to start trading off. I've seen that too often with some highly technical areas. And there's risks, don't get me wrong. Whenever you're going for a big payoff, you're going to have some big risks associated with it. But we have to be very diligent about delivering to cost and to schedule. And that definitely helps when we have a requirement in place. But I think we have to make sure we don't oversell what we have. And I think this approach of early prototyping to see what's out there is a great step in the right direction, and delivering hardware with a proposal or delivering some type of indication of your technology maturity when you deliver a proposal will help us overcome some of those challenges from the past.
So I had a quick follow-up based on this, and then we'll change topics. So Secretary Mattis addressed the lack of communication between government and private sector this morning as a big challenge, and lawyers need to change from stopping comms to facilitation. So the group here has spoken of the importance of communications. Aren't open communications an aspiration? How would you grade where we are now for the entire group?
Want me to go first? Are you gonna-
Yeah, we'll get industry. You're gonna go first.
Well, I guess I think, for some reason, there's a thought that if you work with industry and collaborate with industry, that there can't be competition, and I don't understand that, because you can sit down with industry and have the dialogue, we can provide feedback, and even though we're collaborating on the requirements and the art of the possible, that still allows full and open competition for you to get what you're after. And as we talked earlier, especially if you require industry to provide technology, whether it's in subsystem or system demos or prototyping, if industry is able to provide that to you, it allows that to work. And I personally don't have a problem if you go visit my competitors, visit our facilities, see what we're capable of doing, visit our competitors. Again, as long as you're working around the system, going through the system, if you will, going to each competitor, understanding the requirements of everybody, then you can have a competition and still get what you're after. So I don't think by talking to industry right now that's going to, again, you've got to go work through your process with your lawyers and et cetera. But I just don't think by collaborating with all of us, if you're leaving certain people out, I can see where that'd be a problem. But if you're collaborating with all of us, understanding requirements for all of us, and taking that back, looking at our capabilities and conducting a competition, I don't see why there can't be competition with collaboration.
I don't know if we want to go in order, but I'll weigh in right quick. And I think you hit it, right? In the past, and I don't have a clear path for it yet, but the challenge has been talking to everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, therein lies the issue. Right now, the way the rules and the construct is set up, and oh, by the way, I'm still looking for the rule written down, but my lawyers tell me it's there. Right now, if I talk to you about a given capability, I have to talk to everybody who has something similar, and that becomes the challenge. Right? If we're not careful, we'll spend all of our time just going around meeting with everybody. So that's the part we have to get our arms around. A concept, I happened to have the opportunity last week to sit in with Ellen Lord and one of the industry associations, and that's a forum. And as I was sitting there, that came to me as a good opportunity to reach multiple industry partners at one time and talk about things. But feedback I got from industry, which I'd love to hear your perspective on, is we're not going to share but so much when we're in a room with our competitors. Okay, so it's a catch-22. Our ability and time to get around to everybody, from the people, on the government side, and then industry's ability, which I understand, you have to maintain your competitive advantage to share when there's other people in the room. So that's the thing we have to work our way through. I don't know if it is kind of a lawyer thing too, but it's a combined team issue that we have to figure out, and I haven't figured it out yet.
Well, just if I can, when we do, for example, we as an OEM have to have competition with our first-tier suppliers. So we bring everybody in and have conferences, work the requirements with them, all of them, as you said, in those general forums. And again, we're not dictating solutions, we're dictating our requirements to them that they have to go meet. So they don't have to necessarily in these forums tell us what their IP is or what their solutions are, but we're definitely communicating on what the requirements are and what we need. Now, they'll individually provide, like you said, their proposals, or they'll provide us their technology demonstrations or what they're able to bear individually so we can see that. But by bringing everybody together at one time, we're able to do get the requirements out, get it back, understand what they've got, and make a selection that we believe is a good competitive selection. So I think there are ways to do it, and still protect what everybody considers our IP in the process.
So I'm gonna hold everybody's feet to the fire. So he asked for a grade.
Yes.
So what grade would you
What
give?
grade?
Yeah.
Well, I would
Pick a
tell you
letter,
that.
pick a letter.
The way I would answer this is, I can tell you that there are different levels. Since I've worked with all the services.
You're not a lawyer, are you?
No, I'm not a lawyer. No, I'm an engineer. So, but everybody, the services all participate at different levels, okay, in collaborating with us. I can honestly say the Army is the hardest to collaborate with. Out of all the services I've worked with, the Army is the hardest. So I don't know if I can give you a grade or not. I'll just tell you it's the hardest.
Because,
Well, if I have to give us a grade, I'd say it'd be a C- at best.
Okay.
That's about where I'm at.
Yes.
And it's all around collaboration.
It-
Nobody will
exactly.
talk to us.
So, and I think it's
Yeah.
I think part of it's culture too. So, you know, I don't think it's necessarily about getting to everybody, which would be next to impossible, but providing the same opportunity to everybody. So it's, the onus is really, I think, on industry, not necessarily on us. If you're willing to meet with one, you have to be willing to meet with whoever else offers a similar capability.
Yes.
And once again, I mean, so there are pieces of glimmering hope here. So we set the chief down with industry for MPF, and we spent, the chief personally spent about 7.5 hours, and then the Vice General Allen at the time came over and finished it off about 5 hours. So about 12 to 14 hours sitting down with everybody that was interested in MPF, and it was really designed, and I say this because I designed it, to allow industry to come in and provide their feedback. So here's our requirements. Come back and tell us, you know, where you're gonna have problems meeting schedule, cost, performance issues, and how would you recommend we change our requirements before this goes out in a formal requirements document? I think that was very, very useful, and it was just not the major primes, it was some of the subs as well that would do the component pieces of it.
So you say C-?
C-.
Okay, all right.
I never disagree with you.
Okay.
And I would just like to add, I know that we do hold industry days, and we do send out draft RFPs, and especially MPF, I think, is going out with 2 or 3 draft RFPs before we ever submit the final RFP. So that's a way to get feedback from industry and anyone who's interested in it without having to meet. But then the industry days are there for the questions and further clarification. Is that process working?
Yes, and then you bring us in individually too on those,
Right.
right, after you, yeah, I think so.
So Mr. Snyder, was C- okay with you? or-
C- is good.
Okay.
I'll endorse the group, yes.
But
I just
think
wanted to
he's
get that on
saying-
record.
No, but I think he's saying, but the Air Force and the Navy probably at least, what, A, B?
Yeah, I would, you know, for us, I guess if you say Navy, including the Marines.
Yes.
Yes, I would think there were probably, the Air Force, and they're pretty equal, the Air Force and Navy Marines on working with industry to.
I'm just trying to figure out how big of a gap we need to close here. So they're an A or a B?
Maybe
How about
a
I
B
give them
minus?
I'll give them a B plus.
B plus, okay, all right. Just gotta know where your competition is.
Okay, got
you
it.
know, you gotta- Okay, thank you. That's possible. We can close that gap.
the
Okay.
grade's on a curve.
Yeah.
So let's change the topic for a little bit, General Tyler. So in an effort to evaluate the network and integrate capabilities into an exercise that works, how is the Army managing the challenge of identifying Army joint formations for these opportunities? But I want to add one more thing in that, if you can think about it as you go through, because I'm going to combine another question. The other question is, how are you evolving, how is NIE evolving to support these new Army initiatives? And you can think of that from the joint perspective as well.
Yeah, I think, again, I go back to the JWA. I mean, I think there are multiple aspects of the network. You know, when I first kind of came on board at JMC, everyone always talked about the network, like it was the Borg. And the fact is there are multiple the networks, right? And so I think as we look at the joint aspects, in JWA, we'll have an opportunity here to really work on, you know, a technological piece of how do we talk to each other in a mission partner environment, the processes we use, and then sort of the personalities and how we each sort of approach mission command. So I think again, from the inception of a JWA exercise, that the joint and multinational interoperability is sort of built in there. I think you asked about the future of the NIE, so I can tell you.
I think I was focused more on how you're going to support the new Army initiative. So
Yeah,
we have
well,
these 6
okay.
modernization areas.
Okay,
Yeah.
so, well, I can tell you right now, we are planning a network integration evaluation for fall of 2018. Now, what ultimate form that will take is to be determined. I can tell you that having gone through one and been a part of maybe 1 or 2 others, I think those fully resourced, integrated network events also provide platforms, venues, if you will, that other concepts and capabilities can be put into. And we're certainly doing that. In the recent NIE from this summer, it wasn't just all about the network. It again, provided a venue where other things can come in there. I can tell you we've had interest from other services in participating in those venues. Just talked to one of our allied armies earlier today, and I told him, I think whatever those venues ultimately become, whether they're a full-scale, integrated, fully resourced to a shorter assessment, I think there's opportunity for both joint and multinational partners to engage in those at some sort of scale or some sort of scope.
So maybe just a quick follow-up. How does industry get feedback on their capabilities from the JWAs?
From the JWA, so
Or the NIE, which, either one.
Right. So we provide a report at the end of any one of our exercises here. I think, before the exercise, we have folks that want to get their technology or their concept or capability into one of the exercises. And if for whatever reason it doesn't make the cut, then feedback is provided, usually within about 30 days of that decision. I think after the conclusion of the exercise, and if we're being frank, we have industry representatives that come out and observe throughout the duration of the exercise. So generally, whatever we write is usually not a surprise to anyone. And so I think there is a level of cooperation or a level of, we'll call it integration, but a level of cooperation when we put these technologies in the field and we kind of assess them. We put them through the operational assessment that I think they'll see.
Any comment from industry on?
No, again, I don't have any specifics in here, but, I think the feedback is getting back.
Okay. So, Ms. Adams, can you, how can the acquisition and sustainment communities work together to lower O&S costs?
So, early involvement, working together, identifying the cost drivers. A lot of times, the new development is, just, the next gen of the previous capability. And if we can understand what the drivers were in the legacy system, then that would help us identify where to focus efforts in the new development. Also, through the requirements document and defining the parameters for reliability, maintainability, and O&S cost, that will help us work together to improve that and lower the cost.
It's maybe a follow-up, not quite related, but do we need to do away with low price technically acceptable and look at more than one overall winner to ensure a more reliable and dependable resource supply chain?
So I think there's a role, the low price technically acceptable is a tool, and it should be used where it's appropriate, and is not the answer to every acquisition. And so, I think we do have to make sure that we're using that appropriately, that we have the right contract strategy for the right acquisition, that whether it's supply, spare parts, or a system, or IT, or consulting services. Just need to make sure we use the right tool.
And I think a term you'll hear I mean, really, it's General Ostrowski's term this is best value approach. So it may not be the cheapest one that's up for bid, but what offers the best value to the Army and our soldiers.
Okay. All right, I got a couple of budget questions I thought maybe we'd throw out there now, sir.
Abo's not here.
It says G8 on the form. So do you think, given the budget priorities and funds available, that we are spreading our limited resources across too many programs, which puts many at risk and spreads out our modernization timelines? And then sort of a follow-on to that is there any effort to review the resourcing process, such as the PEGs, to better integrate and streamline resourcing?
So let's take second one first. So not currently, although I've started to hear some of the senior leadership starting to talk about looking about how we do resourcing. So although not currently, I would not rule that out as a future focus area. On the first one, so there are a lot of programs. I have a hard time keeping track of the exact number. 800. We just usually say 830 plus. But you got to realize that, you know, since about the Budget Control Act of 2011, our modernization resources are down somewhere between 40 and 50% based upon how 18 budget actually comes out. So the equipping PEG, to go back to the PEG part of it, which I own, has been squeezed pretty hard over the last 6 or 7 years. So last year's SPAR was focused on finding the efficiencies within the equipping PEG, and that's the only thing it was focused on. Are there low-hanging fruit that we can either eliminate a program, reduce the acquisition objective, slow down the program to save some near-term money? And we went through that for about 9 months, and we did find some, but there were really no easy answers there. We took, I'm not going to go into the dollars again, we took in a pretty hefty option into the chief last year, and ended up him willing to accept the risk, because a lot of that came with high operational risk, graded out by FORCECOM, not by the Army G8. We ended up with probably about 20% of what we actually recommended. So what I'm basically saying is there is not a lot of low-hanging fruit. And we're going to go through that again, because last year we didn't have the lens of the chief and the secretary's 6 top priorities. So we'll take all 830 programs again and try to bend them underneath these 6 priorities. If there's something that is sitting on the side, and I'll just throw out there, let's just say, I'm not going to name a specific program, just say some wheeled vehicle program, because we've got bunches of them. Those, you know, you could look at those as being on the outside, not meeting one of those priorities, or you could look at that really being against all 6 of those priorities. So I think it'll be an interesting discussion again this fall, winter, early spring, because that will definitely be part of the effort to identify, you know, get that 830 down to something with the sole goal of freeing up resources to focus on these top 6 priorities.
So maybe a quick follow-up. Sorry.
Well, let me, while you're thinking about your follow-up, and this audience knows this, and it wouldn't be an opportunity to talk about it. So the Army really only has 3 places where we can allocate resources. It's number 1, structure or people. It's number 2, the readiness of that structure and those people. And number 3 is, a lot of people call it the modernization pot, but it's really installation support, it's MILCON, it's modernization, and it's just outright equipping of programs that we're buying production equipment from. And to build the POM every year, it's really only 2 questions we need to ask the chief and the secretary. One is, like in NDA 17, it was 1.018 million soldiers. So do you want less than 1.018 million soldiers? And the answer was absolutely not. I actually want more. And so once they make that decision, that is 60% of the Army's budget decided right there. And then the next question you ask them is, you know, I understand readiness is your number 1 priority, but would you like to accept some tiered readiness in the formation? Would you like to have some units that are not ready to go while you keep other units that are ready to go? Would you like to go back to 2 rotations for the National Guard at the National Training Center or the CTCs as opposed to 4? And I usually get thrown out of the room about that point, but the answer is no. And so that's another 24% of the budget right there. So that leaves 16% to cover those areas I talked about, MILCON, sustainment of existing equipment, continued procurement of equipment we're buying, and the modernization account. And historically, since 2011, that 16% has been the bill payer.
So just a simple one. So if, since we don't have an 18 budget approved yet, is this impacting your ability to produce the 19 bomb?
So we've got lots of practice of producing palms with no grounding in reality. So no, so I mean, it's, you know, I've only got 2 years' experience doing this, but we have multiple iterations of the palm based upon the variables that are out there. So for 19, which has been built in several different ways, and so we basically take OMB's guidance and we follow that, then we take OSD's guidance and we follow that, and we take BCA level, we follow that. And then we take above OSD's guidance, kind of, you know, building block approach, a very balanced between those three areas I just talked about approach. So we have multiple palms built. Where it's helped us in the past is we've never quite gotten to where we wanted to go, but we've never gotten down to BCA either. So it gives us a middle ground. We build to the higher number, and then when it comes in lower, it's easier to take stuff out than to make up stuff and put into it. So we've got about 4 different courses of action working this palm cycle.
So this is one just for the group. So we've been talking about modernization, acquisition, improving process. We really haven't talked much about technology. So how can industry best help the Army identify new technologies that will significantly improve our capabilities towards the future focus and deter or defeat our near-peer competitors? I don't know if we want to start with industry, but I'd also like to add in the life cycle part of this because it's about the whole life cycle.
Okay. You ready to jump in?
Yes.
Sure.
Okay, so on the technology perspective, so it's really how can industry help you with the technology side of this? So I think that, you know, and again, what's unique about our position here is we have a commercial side of the business too. And so we're driving hard on the commercial side of the business to have new technology and get it to market as quick as possible against our competitors. And so we're constantly investing in research and development. I think it's great, the partnership that we have where you have the contracted research and development and S&T funds that go with it. And coupled it, I think those are areas where we can help. But I do believe that for us as industry, we need to be looking at technologies and investing in our technologies and showing you what is the art of the possible with those technologies. Because, like I said, even when we sit down to design something, you know, for example, on the commercial side of the business, we're working on air taxis, working on hybrid fuels and hybrid ways to develop assets, and we're talking about logistics movers. So there's things that we're doing on the commercial side of the business that can definitely leverage in to the military side of the business. So I think, you know, it's interesting when I sat down with the military, I also talk about what we're doing on the commercial side of the business just to see if there's something that we're investing in there has the ability to be applicable into that side of the business. So, and I think that it was an interesting thing that's most important, besides just the capabilities itself. When we've had folks come and look at what we've had, we've seen the military just as interested in our design tools that we're using now. The digital design tools, the way we're designing things in 3D, the way it ports directly in, and the data management of that tool, it completely relates to what we're talking about here. So it's not just the technical capability side of it. There's the way we're managing it in the processes that I think can bring tremendous capability to this acquisition process and sustainment. You know, we've shown there's ways with this new digital databases that are available, and, you know, I think on the acquisition side, we're not used to that. We think in the standard terms, we're going to do the standard basic development processes, we're going to get our procedurals developed, you know, the tech data packages and everything the way it's currently done. And frankly, there's a whole new way of doing business that's going to be much more cost effective and bring more capability. And that's why even on these design tools we've talked about, we really, on the sustainment side, we think when you have one truth, one data truth, whether you're design, developing, or sustaining, we really want the soldiers in the field to maintain these aircraft by themselves. They don't need contractor support, you know. Maybe if you have to surge us for a little bit to help you get over a hump, but it should be that easy for you to maintain the aircraft we're done. So I think the technologies are not only capabilities, but it's also on the way that we're working in the new design space that can really help in this process.
And I think, you know, a pretty ruthless bidding and prioritization of our S&T efforts, separate from R&D, And there's also an effort, as you would imagine, under these 6 priorities of binning S&T and making sure our S&T investments are in line. And I've said this before, and it's really my personal opinion, is I really don't think the Army ought to be investing in a lot of things from an S&T standpoint that commercial industry is going to do on their own anyway. And I use artificial intelligence all the time, and we have a tendency of thinking we've got, the smartest people, and we got some really smart people. And I'm not sure we got the smartest people in our labs in terms of things like artificial intelligence. In commercial industry, I firmly believe will get there years ahead of us, because there is commercial interest in that. So we got to be focused on our S&T on only the things that DOD/the Army ought to be invested in. And for that example, I use, lightweight materials that provide the same protection as rolled homogeneous armor, because all the auto industry is working on lightweight materials, but none of it will stop a kinetic energy round. So I think it's going to take DOD to drive S&T investments into certain things, but we ought to stay away or invest very little into the things that commercial industry is going to do on their own anyway.
So to add to that, that's kind of how our labs are set up now, where there's commercial aviation expertise. We don't have a lot of in-house aviation. We use contract support for the S&T in that area. But in terms of lethality and missiles and artillery, those type things, we have that lab capability that can produce that, because that's not a commercial use type item. Other ways that industry can help us with technology development is through CRADAs and the cooperative R&D agreements and partnerships. And so we use that a lot in our labs to get after and understand cooperatively how we can work through a technology and learn from each other. And we have open campus with our labs where we're sharing the same space with academia and industry to get after that collaboration, so that we can, because the more you leverage each other's capability, the faster we can develop that technology.
Did you want to jump in there, ma'am, or
No, I don't
No?
have anything else
Okay.
to add.
Okay. General Tyler, anything on that topic at all?
No, I'm good.
Okay. So, so we're talking about technology a little bit. So how long will the next generation of capabilities endure? Is there a case for buying more quickly, assuming experiments will be replaced more quickly so we can actually turn over equipment more quickly? Is this necessary for us to keep pace from a technological challenge or from the technological advances that are actually occurring?
I don't think there's one pat answer to that. I think some things you're talking about that makes absolute perfect sense. I think of anything involving information technologies, I think is going to continue to progress at a point where if we go to a pure fleet solution, which we have tended to do in the past, that by the time we field the last one, it will be about 10 years obsolete. So I think there are certain things that we're going to have to adopt to different ways of doing business to acquire some, and then compete it again. And whatever is the best available on the market at that time, continue. Now that drives the logisticians crazy because they've got different sustainment chains and different pieces and types of equipment they're trying to maintain. Radios are a great example of where I think we have tried to do that in the past and will continue to do it. You know, if you're talking like a future vertical lift platform or a major combat system, we've always been mixed fleets. I mean, we got mixed fleets in our combat vehicles right now. So I think we're going to continue to maintain a mixed fleet, but I don't think that's something you want to recompete every 2 or 3 years. I think that's a little bit longer cycle. But I do think what is key is the ability to, the modular design, the ability to improve over time. And the Army gets a bum rap on its modernization efforts over the last 10, 15 years for a lot of good reasons. But you look at what we've been able to do in terms of incrementally improving the systems we have. I mean, the M1 Abrams of today may look like, generally like the same M1 Abrams we fielded in 1983, but it is a significantly different and better platform. And I use the same analogy, and I heard the Vice use it this morning, is the vehicle all of you drove here today had a steering wheel, an engine, and 4 tires, and so did Henry Ford's Model T, but it's not the same vehicle. So I think we've been actually pretty good at incrementally improving equipment over time. The question is, have we reached the physical limits of the platforms we're on right now?
Anyone else? No? Okay. So let's go to a sort of a broader topic again, acquisition reform. Simple concepts and laws often drive overly complex processes. As rules are added for each stumble, how can we prune the process while keeping the spirit?
I think that's $1 million question. Every year, we get additional language of things we have to do, all in the name of acquisition reform, when we haven't even had an opportunity to implement a lot of the things that we got in the previous 2 years. An approach we've taken in ASALT is we're starting to engage with the writers of the legislation up front and early. We've had a couple of sessions, and it's been fairly successful when we take the time to sit down and have conversations about what their intent is. Then it makes it easier for us and as a department to interpret and to actually write the guidance that will meet that intent. For example, we've seen things about, like, you have to use firm fixed price contracts for all FMS things, or you can't use cost type contracts for certain activities. And when we sit down and talk to the staffers and the people who are actually coming out with these ideas, their intent is not what we end up making it out to be, if that makes any sense. We read it and then we interpret it and write it into a regulation or a statute, and it's very complicated and burdensome. But then when we're talking to them about it being complicated and burdensome, we find out that what we ended up with wasn't what they intended when they wrote it. So the only thing that we've been successful with to date is just starting that conversation a lot earlier. And we've even had the opportunity recently to comment on legislation and give them our words, and they've taken it and ran with it for the most part. So we will continue to do that. The only other way I know is to do it just through basic blocking and tackling, and taking them on one by one and just working our way through it and trying to get some things overturned. Because it's definitely an issue. Every year we talk acquisition reform, but we get more and more legislation put on us, which causes us to do things a lot of times slower than we were in the beginning, or makes it more complex and more documentation required, and we end up hindering the very thing that we're trying to make more agile.
And Ms. Easter said, so there's been 50 years of regulations, laws, policies, just general ways of doing stuff piled on top of one another every time somebody made a mistake. So I fundamentally question whether we can actually undo all that if we just need to start with a clean slate, which is probably not going to happen. So we're kind of stuck where she's talking about. But I do think, a couple of things. If we stay focused on outcome and not process, that will help us. And the outcome the Army is after is delivering capability to our soldiers' hands as quickly as we possibly can. So stay focused on the outcome. And then throughout the process that we inevitably have to live with is always continuing to question everything we do about, does this really make sense? And that enables you to go back and challenge the process. Because there's lots of things that we do routinely that routinely just don't make much sense. And so that's one thing General Milley's been very good at, is questioning why we do some of the stuff we do. And it's been very enlightening when you really sit down and peel it apart, and how much stuff you actually do because that's what the process says you should do, as opposed to it really makes sense. So I think that's the two key pieces I'd highlight.
The thing I'd like to highlight is, I think we have to address it from an end-to-end approach. Several years ago, I was in the UAV project office, and we won awards for our acquisition strategy. And that strategy was based upon the contractor had to come with the equipment for a fly-off. he had to demonstrate a certain set of requirements out of the requirements document. We grouped them in A, B, and C. A were a must meet. B, he had to meet as many as possible. And C was a pre-planned product improvement. So there never was the intent that all requirements had to be met initially. But when we went through test, ATEX said we test to the requirements document. And I said, I can tell you right now, we're gonna fail because we're not, we didn't ask them to deliver to the requirements document. Well, that's what we tested. And if they fail and the Army still wants it, then that's the Army's decision. So we started out, you know, being praised for an innovative approach to get something faster and incrementally build on that requirement over time. We failed and then having to overcome a failure as you go forward. And so we're going to have to look at it from an end-to-end process going forward in order to make this, make it more effective, I guess.
An industry comment on that?
I guess the one thing would be interesting to see if it's possible, and you've tried this in the past, is there a way you can pick a particular program and kind of prototype a new way? You know, as we're trying to prototype for you from a technology, is there a way to prototype the acquisition process to say, hey, let's just clean sheet one of these and let's say, what do we really need in terms of the checks and balances in the system and how many signatures do we really need, and kind of lay out a prototype and start maybe small and just see if it works and run it through the system one time to see if it pays off. I'm doing it differently to see if you can get what you were after. Because I understand you've got to go through, you've got legislation, you've got to, you know, all the laws that have been placed on you. And so, but again, is there a way just to pick one and kind of just, if you could start over, because we do it all the time in industry, we greenfield, right? There's a difference going into a factory or an area and trying a brownfield and try and change it, which gets very hard. But greenfield's a great place where you can go and say, you know, if I could start over, this is how I would do it. So that would be one potential option, is maybe prototype a new way.
I'll take that up.
Okay.
Okay, I think that was a great final question myself. Most of the questions that are left we've already covered, and instead of covering things we had done before. What I want to do is give each panel member an opportunity, if you'd like to make a few comments to close out the panel. If not, then we can, I think that was a good way to bring this to closure, try and look at acquisition reform and how we can actually prune the process. And I think the recommendation which was just made was an excellent idea to maybe try something one time to see if we can actually do that. So any comments anybody like to make, or?
I'll just say, one, thanks to my fellow panel members for being a part of today's discussion. I think that we're on the path, the right path for Army modernization and acquisition reform. There's a lot of things that we can do better. We have a lot of great people doing a lot of great work, but we recognize the need and the criticality of basically doing business differently going forward. The threat and the environment that we have to operate in the future will not allow us to continue to do business as usual. And I just want everybody in the audience to know that we in Army Acquisition are committed to making those changes and getting our warfighters what they need.
I'd just add, so it's, I mean, once again, we say acquisition, we immediately look at Miss Easter, so it's the big A acquisition, so it's from, you know, the good idea all the way through the divestiture of the piece of equipment we're really talking about. And I actually do agree wholeheartedly with Miss Easter that, I mean, if you've looked at anything the Chief's work over the last couple of years about the future operational environment, you look around the world today, a very unpredictable, unstable environment. And I remain focused on delivering capability to our soldiers as quickly as we possibly can. And I also have some faith in how this will all turn out, this new approach, simply because we can't afford to fail. And we won't get there without each of you's help to help us get us there. So thank you for your participation today, and thank you for the help I know you will give us in the coming years as we work our way through this.
So I'd like to thank Ms. Easter for inviting me to participate today, and thank you all for attending. I would like to leave you with a quote from Albert Einstein, where he said, "The world that we've created is the process of our thinking. And if you want to change the world you're in, you have to change your thinking." And so as we are pivoting the strategic focus in the Army to modernization, it's going to require us to change our thinking going forward. And one way to do that is collaboration. So I hope that, I'd like to challenge all of us to think differently and to collaborate more.
I'd make a pitch again for making sure the soldier's voice is always heard in this. Of course, there's a lot of soldiers, and what my organization really tries to do is make sure that we understand the great mass of opinion that we have, right? It's to provide really common sense feedback to the Army as a whole and to programs as we can. I think the other piece, again, and I mentioned it, is, I don't think every time we do an acquisition program, we have to swing for the fences, get the flying tank with plastic armor and lasers. Sometimes, as General Murray said, it's what's good enough. And really, our qualitative edge is the other pieces of that doctrine, organization, training, and particularly our leadership and the type of soldiers that we have. And so I think sometimes folks lose sight of the other aspects here of modernization. It's not just about the things. And I'll leave with a quote as well, just because I like it so much. I love the quote that's attributed to William Gibson that says, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed." And so I think that's something that I always look for, because I see every unit that I look at has some aspect that we can capitalize on. And I really think there's synergy in putting that together in our future force.
Thanks. And I appreciate the opportunity to be on the panel with this esteemed group. And I can tell you that from an industry representative here, we really do support your initiative. We'd love to work with you on how you could reform it going forward. As industry, we absolutely want to support the warfighter and get this capability to them as quick as possible. And I'll leave you with the fact too, though, that as industry, we need to execute. When we sign up to the requirements and the schedules and the cost, we have to execute too. So we owe that to the warfighter as well. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panel for an interesting discussion today.